It seems that it is going to rain this afternoon. Nothing out of the ordinary. Mexico City disappeared under the water. And the most disturbing thing is that no one believed it was in danger. Quick, cover everything. The water is rising too fast. I had never seen something like this in September of 1629. The most powerful capital of New Spain continued to function with apparent normality. The markets opened their doors. The bells marked the hours. The carriages crossed the squares crowded with merchants and officials. But while life continued, something invisible was already happening under the city. The rain had been falling for hours without rest. The canals began to become saturated. The water advanced slowly through streets that had been built over the ancient bed of a lake that never completely disappeared. And when the authorities understood the magnitude of the problem, it was already too late. What began as a storm ended up becoming one of the greatest urban catastrophes in the history of America. A flood so devastating that it left Mexico City submerged for years. This is the reconstruction of the last hours before one of the most important cities of the colonial world was swallowed by the water. The morning of September 21st, 1629 began like so many others in Mexico City. No one was running through the streets. No one was talking about evacuations. No one imagined that they were living the last hours of normality before one of the greatest urban catastrophes in the history of America. The merchants opened their businesses in the Plaza Mayor. The officials of the viceroyalty went to their offices. The bells of churches and convents marked the usual rhythm of the day. At first glance, the capital of New Spain seemed to be at the highest point of its power. It was a rich, influential city and deeply convinced of its own stability. But there was a detail that most of its inhabitants barely perceived. That entire metropolis of stone, palaces, markets, and cathedrals had been built in the center of a closed basin on a territory whose history had always been linked to water. Under the streets where the carriages circulated and under the buildings where the most important decisions of the continent were made, the physical memory of the ancient lake system, which had given rise to Tenochtitlan, continued to exist for decades. The viceregal authorities had tried to control that reality through canals, dikes, and ambitious drainage projects. Some of those works represented authentic feats of engineering for their time. However, they also faced technical limitations, maintenance problems, and geographical challenges that accumulated silently year after year. The disturbing thing is that none of those vulnerabilities were visible to those who walked the streets that morning. The city was functioning, the markets were prospering, the institutions were operating normally. Everything seemed to indicate that the system was under control, and precisely for that reason, when the sky began to close over the valley, almost no one understood what was about to happen. Because this story does not begin with a flood. It begins with a city convinced that it was safe. To understand the magnitude of the catastrophe that was about to unfold, it is first necessary to observe what Mexico City was like during the days prior to the flood of September 1629. The records of the city council, religious chronicles, and administrative documents of the time describe a capital that functioned with apparent normality. At first glance, nothing seemed to announce the crisis that was about to transform the lives of thousands of people. The heart of the city projected an image of prosperity and stability. Over the ancient space occupied by the lakes stretched an urban layout organized according to the principles of European urbanism. Straight streets connected squares, convents, administrative buildings, and residences of the colonial elite. The great palaces of red tizonal and gray quarry stone dominated the landscape, while the towers of churches and monasteries stood out over the roofs as visible symbols of the political and religious power of New Spain. The Plaza Mayor constituted the center of that complex urban machinery. There converged royal officials, merchants, religious figures, artisans, and travelers from different territories of the Spanish Empire. The Parian market brought together products arriving from Europe, Asia, and America. Oriental silks, spices, cocoa, textiles, and precious metals circulated daily through a space that reflected the enormous economic importance of the city within the commercial networks of the 17th century. During those days in September, daily activity continued to take place without significant alterations. Judicial hearings continued to be held. Merchants opened their businesses at dawn. The bells marked the hours of work, prayer, and rest. Carriages advanced along the main streets while porters, vendors, and workers traveled through the most crowded neighborhoods. For the majority of the inhabitants, the city functioned exactly as it had functioned for years. How many do you need? However, behind that image of order existed a more complex reality. Mexico City occupied the center of a closed basin whose relationship with water had conditioned human life for centuries. Floods were not a phenomenon unknown to its inhabitants since pre-Hispanic times. Different generations had had to develop solutions to live with the variations in the level of the lakes and with the intense seasonal rains characteristic of the valley. During the first decades of the viceregal period, important projects were promoted to control that permanent challenge. Among them stood out the cut of Nochistongo, one of the most ambitious hydraulic works undertaken in America during that era. Its goal was to reduce the risk of flooding by evacuating excess water outside the basin. However, The magnitude of the enterprise, technical difficulties, and high economic costs caused delays, modifications, and periods of insufficient maintenance that limited part of its effectiveness. Many officials trusted that the existing works would be enough to protect the capital against future contingencies. That trust was also shared by a significant part of the population after years of investments, engineering projects, and administrative efforts. The prevailing feeling was that the city had the necessary resources to face the known threats of the environment. That is why it is so revealing to observe those last days before the disaster. The most important capital of New Spain continued to project an image of strength, wealth, and continuity. The markets remained full. The temples continued to receive the faithful. The institutions functioned normally. Nothing seemed to indicate that the hydraulic balance of the valley was under increasing pressure. But while daily life followed its course, the conditions that would make the catastrophe possible were already beginning to accumulate: the saturated soil, the limitations of the drainage systems, and the arrival of exceptional rains formed a combination that very few managed to perceive. The city continued moving towards the future with absolute confidence, and precisely for that reason the impact of what was about to occur would be so devastating. The 21st of September, 1629, during the Feast of St. Matthew, the meteorological statistics of the valley fractured irreversibly. What began at noon as a typical late summer storm, an ordinary atmospheric event that barely forced passers-by to seek rushed refuge under the solid quarry stone arches, mutated swiftly into a climatic anomaly of biblical proportions. The logs of the Franciscan friars and the emergency reports of the city council are unanimous and chilling in their description. The sky over Mexico City did not simply cloud over, it seemed to have been completely transformed. A mass of clouds of a blackish gray, dense and charged with static, completely blocked the sunlight, plunging the imperial capital into a premature, suffocating, and unnatural darkness. And then the water began to fall with unaccustomed violence. But we are not talking about a severe tropical downpour. We are talking about 36 consecutive hours of uninterrupted hydraulic bombardment, a curtain of rain so thick that it reduced visibility to a few meters of distance, accompanied by a deafening and continuous roar caused by millions of liters of water, impacting mercilessly against the domes of the churches, the red tile roofs, and the cobblestones. At what exact moment does the daily annoyance of getting your boots wet transform into a crisis capable of paralyzing an entire city in an animal instinct for survival? It happens when the human mind processes with a chill down its neck that the physical environment has stopped responding to the laws of normality. During the first hours of the deluge, the general attitude in the streets was mere logistical annoyance. In the opulent Parian market, merchants hurriedly covered their silk bales, cured tobacco, and valuable sacks of cocoa with heavy wax tarps. Muttering curses and hoping that the downpour would let up to resume sales, carriages pushed their way toward the archways of the palaces, with the coachmen whipping the horses to escape the puddles. However, at nightfall on the 21st and at the breaking of the pale dawn of the 22nd, with the storm maintaining its initial fury, without giving up a single drop of pressure, the annoyance evaporated completely to give way to absolute despair. European urban design, that perfect Renaissance grid that the viceroyalty was so proud of, began to show its rotten seams. The minor ditches and drainage canals that crossed the city, chronically strangled by the historical accumulation of urban trash, volcanic ash, and flagrant administrative abandonment, simply collapsed. The rainwater, upon colliding against underground walls without finding an exit valve, initiated a macabre backflow effect. The sewers began to regurgitate toward the surface a thick, black, and foul mixture, composed of toxic mud, detritus, dead animals, and sewage. Visually, the transition was as fast as it was terrifying. The firm stone streets, the pride of the crown's engineering, disappeared, swallowed under a rising layer of dark mud. Pure panic took hold of the commercial squares. The judicial acts and the guard reports of the era recount the chaos of those critical moments. Men and women running in terror, slipping and falling to their knees in the mud, trying to save merchandise valued at thousands of pesos of gold. Boxes of expensive spices, barrels of wine, and heavy furniture began to loosen from their moorings, floating adrift along what were previously the most secure and monitored avenues of the continent. The true terror of those 36 hours did not reside solely in the kinetic force of the water falling from the sky, but in the topographical trap that was closing from the subsoil. Mexico City, settled capriciously on the bottom of an endorheic basin, operated under the elementary physics of an immense stone bathtub with the drain plugged. Every drop of rain that fell on the surrounding mountain range ran inexorably toward the center of the city. Looking up was facing a black sky that refused to give a respite. Looking down was observing, paralyzed, how the waterline of dirty and frozen water rose past the ankles, then devoured the calves until it threatened to reach the waist. The geography had initiated its tactical siege, and the richest metropolis of America was absolutely cornered. Without escape routes, waiting for the final blow, when absolute chaos dominates the public space. The primary instinct of the human being dictates a single evasive maneuver: entrench yourself. Upon observing the city besieged by the incessant rain, the demographic movement was unanimous. From the great merchants of Basque origin to the laborers of the humblest castes, the population retreated into the intimacy of their homes. They locked with lime and stone the heavy oak doors with wrought iron fittings in the mansions of the central layout and blocked with wood and stones the flimsy entrances of the adobe huts on the periphery. For a few hours on that 21st of September, there existed the vain illusion that domestic architecture would resist the siege. But what is the point of locking the main door when the enemy sprouts directly from the subsoil? The transition from logistical annoyance to pure psychological terror occurred behind closed doors. The analysis of the testimonies collected by the Inquisition and the local parish priests allows us to pinpoint the exact instant when the vice-regal reality fractured. The water did not strike the walls like a furious wave. At first it operated with a stealthy and methodical invasion. A dark, thick, and icy thread of residual water began to seep under the thresholds. The rancid smell of the collapsed sewers invaded the reception halls lined with Flemish tapestries and the modest rammed earth rooms with identical aggressiveness. At this level of documentary analysis, it is fascinating to observe how a geological event operates as an instant social equalizer. The flood did not check noble titles inside the palaces on Tacuba Street. Slaves and lords worked side by side in a choreography dictated by panic, lifting carved chests, raising heavy sacks of flour to mahogany tables, trying to save tax documents and silver bars on the other side of the city. In the Indian neighborhoods like San Juan Tenochtitlan, families piled their meager clay belongings on mats, observing with despair how the adobe of their walls began to dissolve like sugar in a cup of hot tea. But the water did not stop at the ankles. The barometric pressure kept the sky discharging liters per second, and the underground lake, fattened by the currents coming down from the hills, pushed the water table upward. The waterline inside the living room scaled to the calves and then to the knees. This is where the environment changes from mere urgency to a deep and suffocating claustrophobia. The night of the 22nd of September fell over an unrecognizable city. There was no dry wood to light chimneys. There were no ovens operating. Mexico City, one of the most influential metropolises of the continent, plunged into a darkness barely interrupted by the flickering of some candles held by trembling hands. What do you do when the greatest fortress you possess, your ultimate refuge, becomes from one minute to the next a death trap? If you open the door to flee, the strong current of toxic mud running through the street drags you toward certain death. If you stay, the level of the cold and dirty water continues to rise millimeter by millimeter in the darkness of your own house. The sound of the water licking the furniture, the creaking of the swelling wood, and the contained crying of the children on the second floor composed the true soundtrack of the disaster. The citizens were forced to play cat and mouse with an element that does not negotiate. Cornered with the oxygen level fouling due to the smell of early putrefaction, they finally understood that they were waging a war lost in advance against geography. And while families watched helplessly as the water continued to advance room by room, it is worth remembering something. Many of these details survived only thanks to chronicles and records and testimonies that managed to cross the centuries. If you enjoy these types of historical reconstructions and want to continue exploring little-known episodes like this one, you can join us by subscribing to the channel. And since we are reconstructing this history among all of us, I would like to know from what city or country you are watching us today. Every system subjected to constant pressure ends up approaching its limit after almost 2 days of uninterrupted rain. The hydraulic defenses that protected Mexico City began to show worrying signs in different parts of the valley. Water levels continued to rise, while canals and drains worked far beyond their capacity. For the majority of the inhabitants, the situation remained confusing. Information circulated slowly and rumors spread faster than official reports. Some claimed that the level would begin to drop in a matter of hours. Others spoke of increasing damage to the structures that contained the lake's waters. No one knew for sure what was happening beyond their own neighborhood. What they could perceive was a disturbing feeling of change. The water was advancing at a speed that no longer seemed compatible with the rain falling from the sky. In several areas of the city, the current began to gain strength, dragging furniture, animals, and merchandise that just a few hours before remained protected inside warehouses and homes. Then came the moment that many chroniclers would later describe as the true point of no return. The barriers that separated the city from the large bodies of water in the valley stopped containing the accumulated pressure. The flow increased suddenly and enormous volumes of water began to move toward the lower urban areas. The Plaza Mayor, political and commercial heart of New Spain, began to transform before the eyes of those who still remained there. The portals disappeared partially under the water, carriages became immobilized, commercial stalls were abandoned in a hurry. What for decades had functioned as a symbol of stability began to seem unrecognizable from that instant. The population's reaction was almost instinctive. It was no longer about protecting property or saving merchandise. The goal was to find height. Entire families sought refuge on the upper floors of homes, in convents, churches, and buildings of more solid construction. The bell towers filled with people observing with disbelief as the streets disappeared under an increasingly extensive surface of dark water and mud. The bells began to ring throughout the city. Their echo mingled with the shouts, the crashing of objects dragged by the current, and the constant noise of the water advancing between the buildings. The most important capital of New Spain remained standing, but the daily life that had defined it until then had just disappeared. The dawn of the 23rd of September did not bring relief. When the rain finally began to lose intensity and visibility improved, the inhabitants who remained sheltered on rooftops, balconies, and bell towers were able to observe for the first time the true dimension of the catastrophe in front of them. The vibrant capital of New Spain no longer appeared, but an unrecognizable landscape. Entire streets had disappeared under the water. The boundaries between squares, avenues, and canals had been completely erased from the heights. The city seemed to have been transformed into an immense aquatic expanse, dotted with roofs, towers, and domes emerging above the surface. During the first days, many believed that it was a temporary emergency. The general expectation was that the level would descend in a matter of days or weeks. Allowing the usual routine to be rebuilt, however, as the days went by, it began to become clear that recovery would not be quick. The water remained stagnant in large areas of the city, hindering any attempt to return to normality. Land routes disappeared and numerous buildings were left inaccessible from the street. What initially seemed like a passing crisis began to acquire the appearance of a new reality. The urban transformation was immediate. Carriages stopped circulating, markets operated intermittently. Daily travel came to depend on small boats. Canoe after canoe began to travel what had previously been commercial streets. Administrative corridors and residential areas, officials, merchants, religious figures, and neighbors now shared the same scenario of permanent improvisation to attend mass, transport food, or exchange merchandise. It was necessary to navigate between partially flooded buildings and cross improvised canals that constantly changed in depth and route. But the difficulty in moving was only part of the problem. Very soon a less visible and much more persistent threat arose. Drowned animals remained trapped between the stagnant water and the rubble. Flooded warehouses lost entire harvests of wheat, corn, and other essential products. Constant humidity deteriorated homes, furniture, and wooden structures. The air began to fill with increasingly intense smells, while sanitary conditions worsened day after day. In an era where medical knowledge was limited, the spread of diseases became a constant concern for authorities and for the population that still remained in the city. The uncertainty ended up fueling a progressive exodus. Many families decided to abandon their homes and seek refuge in nearby towns located on higher ground. Merchants temporarily relocated their activities. Artisans left workshops that had become unusable. Numerous neighborhoods lost a considerable part of their inhabitants. The capital continued to be the political center of New Spain, but its daily life had been profoundly altered. The constant movement of people, goods, and news that characterized the city was drastically reduced. With the passing of the months, the inhabitants who remained there had to adapt to an existence unthinkable before the flood. Boats became part of the daily landscape. Transport routes changed. Public spaces stopped functioning as they had functioned for generations. Even religious ceremonies and many administrative activities had to adjust to the new conditions. The most surprising thing is that situation did not last a few weeks or a few months. It lasted for years. For an entire generation of inhabitants, living surrounded by water stopped being an exceptional emergency and became the daily reality of a city that tried to survive while waiting patiently for the return of dry land. When auditing this tragedy visually and documentarily, carefully setting aside the veil of myths, exaggerations, and moralizing sermons of the 17th century, the conclusion is imposed with an irrefutable historical weight. The Great Flood of 1629 was not a misunderstood climatic anomaly, much less a divine punishment. It was, in the most precise forensic terms possible, the consequence of an extraordinary combination of meteorological conditions, hydraulic limitation, and geographical characteristics of the valley. The Spanish Empire invested incalculable fortunes and decades of physical effort trying to erase from the map the lake past of Tenochtitlan. They operated under the conviction widely shared at that time that new hydraulic works would be enough to control the complex conditions of the valley. But water always collects its debts, and that last week of September, nature collected the bill with usurious interest, drowning the arrogance of the richest and most important city on the continent under tons of toxic mud. Those citizens who managed to survive the initial kinetic impact, the first 36 hours of blind panic and structural destruction, did not receive any type of pardon. They were condemned to live poorly for half a decade, literally floating over the shattered ruins of their palaces, their businesses, and their unshakable certainty. The lesson that this declassified file throws is forceful, chilling, and remains dangerously current to this day. Modern civil engineering can trace perfect grids, build impenetrable monolithic walls, and inject millions of tons of asphalt, steel, and cement over the bed of an ancient lake. It can create, with astonishing precision, the comforting illusion of absolute control over the environment, but at the end of the day, historical files show us that human infrastructure will always be, without exception, a simple temporary guest in the land of the waters, and perhaps that is the most disturbing part of this whole story. 4 centuries later, we continue to inhabit the same valley and we continue to face many of the same challenges. If you found this reconstruction interesting, join us in the next historical files that we will be opening here in Nostalgia Latina, and before closing this chapter, I would like to read your comments. From what city or country are you watching this documentary? And what period of history would you like to explore in the next video? Because many times the most surprising stories are not the most famous ones, but the ones that remained hidden for centuries.